Hello, world. This week, I thought that I would do something a little bit different. Now, French Ember is still ongoing. I do plan to finish that series. I do plan to give you some more videos on the Vinegar variation, as well as on the classical variation. I'll extend the series into January if necessary. But this past weekend, I was a bit distracted from making my videos. I do still have some games planned. In fact, I've got a very exciting game for the Vinegar planned. But this past weekend, I played in a tournament. I played at the Hart House Holidays Open in the under 2200 section, and I've got some interesting stuff to talk about. So I thought, hey, why don't I make a video about all this while it's still on my mind, while it's still fresh on my mind. So, going into this tournament, I didn't really have too many crazy expectations or anything. Like, going into the tournament, my repertoire is still incomplete. I still have a whole bunch of things I'm working on when it comes to my openings and a whole bunch of stuff that I'm still studying. Like, one thing I know that I need to study, like, especially based off of some of the games in this tournament, is I really need to work on my end games. So I wasn't expecting anything too crazy. But throughout this tournament, I did get some excellent feedback from my games regarding what it is I'm currently doing well, as well as what it is that I need to work on. So, let's see. Without further ado, I think I should get into the first round and talk about that. So, in round one, I had the white pieces, so that's my real name on the bottom there. And for this tournament, I decided to just bring a simplified version of my repertoire. In fact, I brought a two opening repertoire, which you might think, wait, how can you have a two opening repertoire? Doesn't a repertoire need at least three openings in it? Don't you need something with white, something with black against e4, and something with black against d4? Like, how can you have just two openings to deal with those three situations? And, well, we're going to see an answer to that question with the first move in this game, pawn to f4. So, I don't really have a whole lot to say about myself or my opponent. Like, currently, what's it called? I'm rated about 2000 CFC. I'm working on becoming 2200 CFC, as that's roughly the strength you need to be a national master, but I know that I'm not there yet. I know that there's still stuff to work on. And my opponent is a high 1800, and they played fairly well. I think they're either like a preteen or a young teenager, like just based off of their appearance. I could tell that they are a minor, and yeah, just seemed like a nice guy. Anyway, so for the first move of this game, I played pawn to f4, and you probably now see what I mean when I say that I brought a two opening repertoire, because pawn to f4 is very often met with pawn to d5, and this is basically the Dutch defense, but with the colors reversed. First, like the Dutch defense begins with the moves d4, f5. And it's a very complicated opening, but also a very fun one. Now, one important difference between the bird and the Dutch, though, is you have to be ready for Fromm's gambits, like if you're playing it with white. Like with the Dutch, there are a ton of other anti-Dutch lines you have to worry about. But if you're playing the bird, you have to study this gambit. You have to know how to deal with this gambit. And if you don't, you'll get destroyed. This is why the bird is not a good opening for beginners to play. Like, beginners should generally stay away from the bird unless they have learned another opening first and gotten some idea of what other openings are like. Because, like, in Fromm's Gambit, like, basically, you have to watch for queen coming here, giving checkmate. So then knight f3, and then the main moves for black would either be g5, knight f6, and sometimes bishop g4, and it can get very, very chaotic. The position can become a mess. Fromm's Gambit is an excellent choice for black during blitz. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I don't generally like playing the bird in blitz games. But in rapid, the bird is actually a decent choice in my opinion because you have a lot more time to deal with the pressure that black puts you under. Like, you'll have more time to get your king to safety and consolidate and just be a pawn up, and not just be a pawn up, but be the only side with central pawns. But anyway, this is not what happened in the game. Another thing I should mention is that while the bird is an opening that I would not recommend to beginners, the Dutch, on the other hand, is one that I think is okay for beginners to play, because normally with the Dutch, there are quite a few anti-Dutch lines that you have to worry about. For example, there's the Staunton Gambit, which is pawn to e4. That's a very sharp line. And like, just to give some idea of how things can go very wrong very fast, like knight c3 attacking the pawn, knight f6 defending the pawn. White will often play bishop g5. That's a popular move. Best move for black is to play pawn to g6, but a lot of beginners or intermediate players don't know this, and they'll play pawn to d5, and this is already a catastrophe, because after bishop takes, it doesn't really matter how black takes back. We'll have queen h5 check, and this is just a horrible, horrible position for black, for example. So that's only one of the things you would have to worry about in the Dutch. Like, bishop to g5 is also a very annoying line. Knight to c3 is an annoying line as well, with the idea of meeting knight to f6 with bishop g5 and then playing for pawn to e4, like basically trying to get this move out very early. And there's also even pawn to g4. This is a problem as well. This looks kind of funny. Like, why would I be okay with beginners playing the Dutch when there are so many more anti-Dutch lines? And the answer is that one trick is you don't have to play f5 on move 1. You can actually play e6. And if e4, then you play d5. And you have a French defense instead. And if your opponent does something else, like c4, then you can play f5, and there's no nastiness. There's no Staunton Gambit, there's no Krajcik Gambit, there's no Hopton attack, no knight c3 anti-Dutch. Anyway, getting quite off track from what happened in the game, but I thought I would just very briefly talk a little bit about my thoughts on the bird and the Dutch, and when it's okay for beginners to play them. Like, playing the Dutch defense with the e6 move order is fine for beginners, in my opinion, because you avoid so many nasty sharp lines, and you can just focus on playing chess. Anyway, what happened in the game was we had f4, d5, and this is basically a reversed Dutch defense. I play knight to f3, my opponent plays knight to f6. Neither one of us is really giving the other much information about our setup. I play pawn to e3. This gives a small amount of information. It basically tells my opponent that I'm not playing a Leningrad, but I might still play a Stonewall or a classical bird. It's kind of unclear. Like, there are actually 3 different ways, like 3 main ways to play the Dutch/bird. Like, the easiest way, like the easiest one to learn, is the Stonewall. That involves, putting pawns on these squares, or if you're black, pawns on these squares. It creates a nice formation that's very hard for the opponent to break. And then there's the Leningrad, which is kind of like a King's Indian, except you have this pawn over here. Leningrad is actually very popular among King's Indian players, because very often with the King's Indian, you run into the issue that all of your opponents know how to play against the King's Indian. So how am I going to get a King's Indian if everybody knows it? It's like, well, none of them really know how to play against the Leningrad or against the Dutch, so why don't I play that? Because it's kind of a similar structure, similar setup, similar ideas, similar crazy complex position. So there's Leningrad, and then in this game we're going to see the classical bird, which is also known as the fluid variation, because with the classical Dutch slash bird, you can kind of go into a stone wall if you want to. Like, you kind of just leave that option open. Like, you don't overcommit to anything. You're very fluid. You're very flexible in terms of what your plan is going to be. And it can be a very fun and dynamic way of playing. So anyway, I play pawn to e3. So this tells my opponent that I'm probably going to be playing either a stonewall or a classical. It's still a bit unclear. My opponent plays bishop to f5, and this tells me a bit of information. Like, this suggests to me that, oh, my opponent is going to be playing some kind of London setup. Like, this is kind of like a London system or a London opening, but with the colors reversed. So against this kind of setup, since my opponent did not play pawn to g6, which is the main line, like the main line against the bird slash Dutch is for the opponent to play a Catalan kind of setup with pawn to g6, bishop g7, castle kingside, pawn to c5, knight to c6, all that kind of stuff. Since my opponent is not doing that, I now have the time to play pawn to b3 and put this dark squared bishop on the long diagonal where it can assist me, where it can help me with my play on the king side. So that's one of the ideas here. So my opponent now played pawn to e6, typical move in the London. I play bishop to b2 because generally if you're going to play b3, you should play bishop b2 right after. Bishop to e7. We have bishop to e2. Ooh, like normally in the classical Dutch slash bird, you play this move earlier and castle before developing the dark square bishop, but the London is kind of an exception just because, maybe your opponent changes their mind and plays g6 at some point and puts the bishop on that diagonal, stuff like that. And there's kind of no rush to castle kingside, like you can delay it if you want. Although, generally speaking, you should castle early, castle often, as they say. So my opponent castled kingside. And here, in this position, the main move is for white to now castle kingside, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But I haven't actually studied this position a huge amount, and I've just played it a number of times, usually with the black pieces, is like usually the colors would be reversed and stuff. But I often find that I like playing pawn to d3 just because it helps prepare the e4 push, which is something that the bird slash Dutch player is very often playing for. They're very often trying to get their pawn onto this square. They're very often trying to have these two pawns be side by side. I'd help them with their kingside play, all that kind of stuff. And not only that, but in this case, the d3 pawn takes away the e4 square from both this knight and this bishop. So that's another reason why I like pawn to d3. There are actually very, very few games in the database that feature this opening, so it's actually very difficult to study it. Although if you do want to study the classical Dutch or the classical bird, I would recommend checking out the chess content created by Grandmaster Simon Williams, also known as Ginger GM. Like, this is basically one of his favorite openings of all time, and he's really passionate about it, and he's got some really, really good stuff, like especially regarding the main lines. Anyway, in this position, my opponent now played pawn to c5, which is a fine move, just fighting for some central control, like pushing this pawn before moving the knight to c6, stuff like that. I now decide to castle kingside, because generally speaking, you should castle. Leaving your king in the center for too long can be very dangerous, especially if your opponent has ways of blasting the center open. My opponent now played knight to c6, and here I now played pawn to h3, taking away the g4 square from both of these pieces. Like, very often the knight coming to g4 can actually be pretty annoying because it hits the pawn on e3, stuff like that. And another idea is, of course, to push the g pawn to g4 and kick this bishop around a bit. Maybe even play pawn to f5 in the future, stuff like that. Like, basically, you go for some kind of kingside attack, go for some kingside play. This kind of plan is actually a sort of plan that can make London players very uncomfortable because, they generally don't like being attacked. They generally just want to be very solid and just get a nice, calm positional advantage out of the opening. Anyway, my opponent now played pawn to h6, probably to make some room for their bishop to retreat. I now play queen to e1, which is a very common move in the classical Dutch / classical bird. Like, the idea is very often for the queen to swing over to g3 or to h4, and it also supports the e3 pawn this way as well. It can also be used to defend this pawn, or to help play pawn to e4. So my opponent now played knight to d7, basically getting ready to play bishop to f6, trade their bishop, which is kind of passive, kind of out of the game, for this bishop, which is on a very strong diagonal. So I play knight bd2, just continuing my development. My opponent plays bishop to f6. I don't want to move my bishop or to spend time defending it, so I just trade. My opponent takes back with the queen. Like, we've both been making good moves so far, nothing too crazy at the moment. I play pawn to g4, or striking at this bishop, forcing it to move. It moves back to h7, and here I now play pawn to a3, which is a fine move. Part of the idea is just to take the b4 square away from this knight, as defending the pawn on c2 might be problematic, it might be tricky to do. So I don't want that knight coming into there. Like, maybe the queen can come into like c3 or b2 or something, but I'm not that scared of that. I think I can just defend with like my queen or something. I'm much more worried about, this knight coming in and harassing my pawns and things like that. So in this position, my opponent played the move pawn to d4, probably with the idea of just kind of weakening my center, like weakening my pawn structure, stuff like that. Taking some space, taking the c3 square there, and the engine really does not like the move pawn to d4, but it also really doesn't like the way that I responded to it either. So one thing that's interesting is I did consider the move that the engine likes. The engine wants me to play pawn to g5, and I was worried about hg5, fg5, and then queen f5, with the idea of hitting the pawn on h3, as well as the pawn on e3. Like, these would both be en prise. But it turns out that this is nothing to worry about. I could just play queen to g3, and then after d takes e3, knight c4, white would actually have a very pleasant position here, and the engine actually gives a pretty substantial advantage to white here. Like, white will just regain the pawn and have very happy pieces and all that. So that's why pawn to d4 isn't so great. But I did not react to it in the correct way. Instead, I played it in a way that's a bit more creative. Like, it turned out to work in the long run, but it also wasn't accurate. It also wasn't correct. I played knight to e4 with the idea of basically getting a pawn to e4 this way. This is kind of creative, kind of fun, but not really correct. So we have d takes e3. The pawn on f4 is under attack, so I bring my queen out to g3, defending it. My opponent plays knight to d4, and this is the best move. Very active square for the knight. Hitting this pawn, hitting my bishop, also hitting this knight right as well. I play bishop to d3. The engine really does not like this. The reason why is because it allows the move pawn to e2 to be played. The engine really wants me to play rook ae1, but I really did not like this because opponent can just take this pawn like this, and I'm just losing so many pawns. Like I've already kind of given up one pawn. I gave up the pawn on e3, and in the classical Dutch/bird, you very often will be sacrificing pawns for the sake of active play, for the sake of improving your pieces and putting pressure on your opponent, and basically being very scary. So I wasn't too worried about giving up one pawn, but giving up multiple pawns unnecessarily just seemed wrong to me. So I played bishop to d3 because I just think this is a better diagonal for my bishop. Anyway, like I might want to play pawn to e5 at some point, activate the bishop that way. But I did underestimate how strong my opponent's play could have been. Like in this position, what my opponent should have done, which they didn't, is that they should have played pawn to e2. It would just really mess up my forces, really discoordinate my pieces. And you might be thinking, oh, I don't see the problem. Can't you just play rook to f2? And the answer is no, I absolutely cannot. Because, this rook would hang after knight takes f3 check. So I would have to play a move such as rook fc1, for example, or rook fe1. It actually doesn't matter too much which one I pick. Because after knight takes check, queen takes, there's actually this really nasty move, which both myself and my opponent, we did not see. We did not. Like, if my opponent had seen this, they would have gone for this kind of line. Knight to e5, very nasty move. I cannot take this knight because then my opponent takes my queen for free. So then after queen to e3, we would have knight takes, and then the engine likes pawn takes d3. The queen takes isn't really much better. Like, there's still problems in either case. And then basically there will be like queen b2, and this line is already just a mess. This is very unpleasant for white. Like, the main reason why this is bad for white isn't just because of this pawn. Like, this pawn's probably going to just get taken at some point. The real issue is that white's pawn structure is filled with weaknesses, and white's king is actually somewhat exposed. And that's really bad, given that we're going into a major piece endgame. We're going into an endgame with queens and rooks on the board. Like, if I turn on the engine's like, blech, it just vomits. It's like white is just very much losing here. But my opponent did not find these moves. Like, in particular, my opponent did not find the very nice move, knight to e5 here, which is part of what enables all of this. Instead, my opponent played a move that it's kind of where they started to go wrong in a way. Like, they played the move knight to b6, and the engine really hates this move. And I also kind of don't like this move, but probably for different reasons than the engine. The reason why I don't like this move is it's taking the knight away from the center or the king side. Like, basically, in this game, I have already very much telegraphed to my opponent that I am going to be playing on the king side. I'm going to be attacking on the king side. So therefore, my opponent should be keeping pieces either in the center, like this knight over here, or on the king side, like the queen. And because then they can deal with whatever it is that I'm going to be doing here. So instead, my opponent is kind of playing on the queen side, which might not be correct since they don't really have a whole lot of stuff there yet. Like, they haven't really gotten the queen side plan in motion so far. Anyway, back to the game. I now played the move rook ae1. I did not miss a beat in making this move. Like, basically, I recognized that my rook is very weak on a1. Like, it's a potential weakness. The queen is eyeing it, wants to take it. So I'm like, okay, I should just get my last piece into the attack, and I should deal with that problem. I should deal with that weakness. So let's just bring the rook over here, where it helps eye this annoying pawn that I probably want to take in the future. My opponent played rook ac8. I don't hate this move. I think this is a fine move. Just activating the rook. I now play knight e5. I've not only improving the position of my knight, moving it to a better square, but also, potentially lining up this rook with the queen, doing some nasty stuff like that. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier is, even though I could have played knight takes knight earlier, I really didn't like the idea of allowing pawn takes, which would make this pawn really strong, really annoying, like really hard to get rid of. So that's why I did not trade knights here. So anyway, my knight is now on e5. It is a very strong knight. Right, I'm getting ready to go with my attack. And my opponent played the move knight to c6, which, from a practical standpoint, might have been the losing move. Like, from a practical standpoint, this is where everything just suddenly starts to really fall apart. In fact, if you want, you can now pause the video and try to find the sequence of moves that happened next. Like, you don't need to think like an engine here. Like, think like a human. Think, what did I now do, and what moves now occurred that could have led to, my opponent losing the game and stuff like that. I will reveal the sequence. Like, basically, pause the video and think about, how should White continue the game? What should White now do? What is White's plan, and how should White continue with that plan? Anyway, I will reveal the moves in 3, 2, 1. So, the way that the game continued is I now played the move pawn to g5, and this is a nasty move. This pawn is attacking the queen, and it's also attacking the pawn on h6. Like, I would be quite happy to just take this pawn with my queen lined up with the king. My opponent cannot take back because of the pin. My opponent would have to, weaken their pawn structure or do something. And so, my opponent doesn't want to move their queen away. My opponent, more or less from a practical standpoint, has to play h takes g5. And now a very strong in-between move, knight to g4, or moving the knight to a much better square where it can better participate in the kingside attack, where it can get access to like the f6 and h6 squares. The knight is attacking the queen, and if my opponent tries counterattacking my queen with a move like g takes f4, one problem with that is that knight takes queen is with check, so my opponent can't do that. So, in this position, there's only really one move for black that will help keep them in the game, and my opponent did not find this move. Like, it's a move that looks a little weird, because the best move, according to the engine, is queen to d4. This would keep my opponent in the game. Like, after f takes g5, my opponent could then start bringing pieces back to help defend. Part of the reason why my opponent didn't play this move is probably because it actually loses a pawn. Like, my opponent would lose their pawn on g5, and I would be able to win this pawn on e3. Stuff like that. So that's probably why my opponent did not do that. And also, probably why I didn't take the move queen d4 that seriously. Like, I saw it as a possibility, but I'm like, nah, I don't think that move's good, and I don't think my opponent's going to play that, so I didn't investigate it too much. Instead, I investigated the move that did occur in the game, which is queen to e7, and already, you can see from the engine's like, oh my god, no. What is this? We have f takes g5, and White is threatening some very nasty stuff here. Really nasty stuff. White is threatening like knight f6 check, and if pawn takes, then pawn takes would be with check, and would, potentially win the queen as well. But even if the queen were on d8, it's still quite scary. Like, there would be, ideas of like queen g7 mate as well. So, my opponent basically has to take this now. My opponent has to take the pawn on g5. according to the engine, my opponent could play pawn to g6, but it's still very unpleasant. Like, opponent could play this, queen h4, pawn to f5, g takes, queen h7, but this position just stinks for black. I could even just trade queens and just play pawn to e5, and then this pawn on f6 is a nightmare. It's awful, awful. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, back in this position, my opponent did the intuitive thing, which is take the pawn. Like, I had calculated all of these moves. Like, starting from when I played pawn to g5, I had calculated all of this. I had expected all of this. And then after pawn to h4, my opponent probably realized that they were in very deep doo-doo. Because things are getting very nasty now. Because if my opponent now plays queen to e7, if they just play a move like that, you know, it's like, what's white gonna do? What's white's idea? And the idea is after knight f6 check, king to h8, queen to g5, I'm threatening checkmate. I'm threatening queen h5, checkmate. My opponent has to deal with this. My opponent has no time to do anything else. So after pawn takes knight, rook takes pawn, I'm still threatening checkmate. Yes, I've sacrificed a knight, but my opponent has to deal with this checkmate somehow. Like, rook g8 is no good because rook h6 would still be mate. My opponent would have to play queen takes f6, and then I take with check, and this is awful. This is very, very bad. Even though from a material standpoint, my opponent might be okay, their king is in a lot of danger, and their other pieces are too far away to save them. So, like, yeah, the engine just says that there's a forced mate in 8 here. Like, I can't see forced mate in 8s, but I can see dead from a practical standpoint. Like, I think this would be resigns in 1, like depending on how strong your opponent is, as opposed to mate in 8. Anyway, this is not what happened in the game. My opponent was actually pretty resilient. They found a clever idea to keep them in the game. So, if you want, back in this position, the idea is that if my opponent retreats their queen, I'm going to go for this knight f6 idea. If you want, you can pause the video and try to find the idea that my opponent now played to try to at least stay alive for a bit longer. Like, try to keep themselves in the game, try to maybe get some counterplay somehow. Like, basically try to keep hope alive. So I will reveal the moves in 3, 2, 1. So my opponent played queen to g6, getting ready, of course, to meet knight f6 check with just pawn takes, stopping the pin over here. But part of the issue with queen g6 is I can play pawn to e5 with a discovered attack on the queen from my bishop. My opponent now plays pawn to f5, blocking the attack, but I can take en passant. But since I have taken with a pawn, that means my knights cannot currently go to f6. So my opponent can now play queen to h5, and there's no idea of knight f6 check, forking the king and queen. There's nothing like that. Now, in this position, the move that I played is fine, but according to the engine, I should have continued with knight takes e3. I instead played knight to e5, and that loses a bit of my advantage, but I thought that from a practical standpoint, this was fine, since both myself and my opponents, we were both actually fairly low on time at this point. Like, I forget exactly how low we were. My opponent might have been down to like 5 minutes, and I might have been at like 15 minutes or something like that. And I basically, he was just like, okay, I'm at the very least going to be winning an exchange here, and I'm pretty happy with that. I'm okay with going into the endgame. But I do have to be a bit careful here. So I played knight to e5, and the threat, of course, is queen takes g7 checkmate. That's a very nasty threat. That's like, my opponent has to deal with that. So my opponent plays rook takes f6, but this rook is not defended by anything. This pawn on g7 is pinned. I play rook takes f6, and my opponent now plays knight takes e5, and I kind of foresaw this move. I was kind of expecting knight takes e5, Although I did consider the alternative, which is much better. And the alternative is actually queen takes e5, and in this position, I should not be too hasty to trade queens. In fact, if I trade queens right now, I actually lose quite a bit of my advantage. In fact, I think it basically completely vanishes, and the game would probably end up being a draw. So basically, both the rook is under attack. I have to move the rook to somewhere. So I could, maybe move the rook to here, for example. But then my opponent takes this bishop, and I take back with this pawn. Taking back with this pawn is important because now this knight has a very powerful outpost on d5 where it would defend this pawn on e3. And the engine's just like, yeah, this is a draw. And it's like, yeah, I agree. This just looks awful. Just looks completely awful. Awful. Like, I do not want this. But the thing is, I don't have to trade queens right away. Like, I can let my opponent be the one who does the queen trade. Because it's actually my opponent who very desperately wants to trade queens, as I just have so many pieces in this attack, and my opponent's pieces can't arrive in time to save them. So it would actually be my opponent who would trade queens. And a very important thing to notice here is that since the trade of this knight for this bishop has not occurred, I still potentially have the move pawn to c4 to kick this knight away from defending the pawn. Like, that's an important resource. Of course, but this is not what happened in the game. My opponent was low on time and played the much more intuitive move knight takes e5. And here I played the move that I had planned for this situation, bishop to g6, just a very nasty move, trying to force this queen away. Like, basically force this queen to be very passive. The queen does not have any nice squares to go to. If it goes to h6, I could even play bishop to f7 check, and after knight takes bishop, rook takes queen. Basically, if I get rid of my opponent's queen, like for rook and bishop, I'm quite happy. Like, queen versus two knights is not a difficult endgame to play. So, as a result, since my opponent did not want their queen to become very passive, did not want their queen to have to go to, like, h8, for example, my opponent did this trade. I took with the rook, and now these two pawns are both under fire. My opponent cannot save both. They have to choose one pawn to give up. And basically, I really, really want to get rid of this pawn on e3. This pawn on e3 is kind of the biggest problem for me to deal with. If I get rid of this pawn, my opponent is just going to lose the endgame. So it makes sense that my opponent, tried to save it. But sadly, this the pawn on g7 is also very important. We have rook takes g7 check. King goes to h8. I play rook to g5. I'm forcing the queen away. I'm looking at ideas involving queen coming to here, perhaps. Nasty things like that. Opponent plays queen to f7, which was inaccurate, but my opponent is very, very low on time at this point in the game. I play rook to f1, hitting the queen, getting ready to bring another piece into the attack. Like, one thing I want to get rid of is the possibility of the knight coming to f6 to help defend. Like, I want maybe to bring my queen to here with check, nasty things like that. Or even just, bring the rook to h5. So it's actually very hard to find a move for my opponents in this position. Like, pretty much everything looks like mate. Like, maybe an engine can find something here. The engine, according to the engine, the best move for black is actually sack the queen for the rook. That's what the engine says black should do. But it's very hard to find a move. The final moves of the game were queen to c7, and then I just played rook to h5 check, and there's a forced mate in 2. I did not actually see the forced mate in 2, but I did see forced mate in 3. Like, I was basically visualizing queen h7, rook takes h7 check, king takes, rook f7 check, and then either queen g7 mate or queen g5 mate, depending on where the king goes. But it turns out that after queen h7, there's actually a forced mate in 2, or Yeah. There's a forced, like a faster checkmate after rook to f7, and then basically white is either going to be playing one of these rooks takes the queen checkmate, or queen to g7 checkmate if the queen takes the rook on h5. But anyway, that was round one. I hope that you enjoyed this game. On to round two. Welcome to round two, and welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at the Alekhine variation of the French defense. So, as you know, the French defense begins with the moves e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, d4, knight b6, knight f3, d5, bishop d3, bishop g4, castles kingside e6 with the idea of playing c5. Now, are there any questions about this line in the French? Okay, there are probably a ton of questions. So let's start back at the beginning. So anyway, I was pretty happy with how round one went. I went back home, took a look at the game, since round one was on a Friday and there was only one round that game, I wanted to just see how well I played, and it's like, hey, yeah, okay, I played pretty well. So going into round two, I knew that I would have a tough opponent. Basically in round one, since it was a Swiss, since it's a Swiss system, Swiss pairings, basically I knew I was in the top half in terms of ratings, for this section, but, kind of near the bottom of the top half. So since I won my game, and since generally the players in the top half will win their games in round one, I knew that since I was in the bottom of the top half, I would now be facing a higher rated opponent in round two. So, indeed I did. I faced an opponent rated almost 2100. And I was thinking, ooh, goody, let's go all out. Let's try to beat this opponent. And so my opponent for this game seemed to be a bit older than my opponent in round one. I wasn't sure. I didn't ask either opponent what their age was because it's not really that interesting to know that exact detail. But from the game, I can kind of tell that my opponent is fairly young because they kind of played it, more tactically than positionally and stuff. Some of the mistakes they made in this game are yeah, I could totally see a young person making those mistakes. For anyone in the audience who's curious, I'm about 30. So anyway, and also I think my opponent's my opponent's surname is a surname that I've seen a number of other players at tournaments I've been playing at have as well. So I wonder if there's a family of players, as it's a fairly uncommon surname. But anyways, he seemed like a nice opponent, and they seemed like a nice family. Anyway, onto the game. So my opponent began the game with pawn to e4. Very standard move. I had the black pieces, so that's why the board is flipped around and all that. And I decided to bring out my trusty Alekhine's defense. One of my favorite openings that I have played since childhood. My opponent responded by playing pawn to e5, which is one of the best, basically the best way to play against the Alekhine is to push the pawn. You should not defend it with knight c3 or d3 or any of this other crazy stuff like bishop to c4 and then sacking the bishop on f7. No, all of that other stuff is bad. Pawn to e5 is the way to go. I played knight to d5. My opponent played pawn to d4. And here I decided to do something a little bit unconventional, a little bit different. Normally the way that the mainline Alekhine goes, normally the way that at Grandmaster games would go, Grandmasters generally play d4 on move 2 as opposed to c4 or knight f3 or some other move. Normally, the way that Alekhine games would go is black plays d6, white plays knight f3, and black plays d takes e5. This is called the Larsen variation. It is kind of the line that is most in the spirit of the Alekhine, like it is, black is going for a very sharp dynamic play. White should not take back with the pawn because black just gets a lot of pressure onto white's position. Like, it kind of looks like white can take away black's castling rights, but this is actually not a good idea because black's just got so much pressure on white's position. Black has plenty of compensation for the loss of the castling rights. It's like knight c2 check is a threat, and black might be able to play bishop takes f3 and ruin white's pawn structure, all that kind of stuff. So that is why in this position, if black plays the Larsen variation, white should take with the knight. Taking with the knight is correct. And here the main moves for black are to play either g6 or c6. The third most popular move, knight d7, is actually not a good move because this sacrifice here is completely sound. And, white would be forking this. So black plays here, and white could now play c4. And if we turn on the engine, I think the engine evaluation speaks for itself. Black should not play like this. This is awful. So basically, that is why in the main line, we go back here after knight takes e5. The main moves are either g6, which would stop queen h5 check, or c6, which would defend this knight. Like, generally, you play one of those two moves, and then you often play knight d7 to try to get rid of this strong knight on e5, stuff like that. But none of this is what happened in the game. Instead, back here, after move 3, d4, after this move, I decided to do something a little bit different, a little bit unconventional. And the reason why I did this is because, like I said at the start of this recap, my opening repertoire is a bit incomplete at the moment. Like, there's still some stuff that I'm working on, still some stuff that I'm studying, and the Larsen variation is something that I know that I need to study more. So that is why I chose to play something a little different. I chose to play kind of a sideline, but it's a really weird sideline that not a lot of people know about, that kind of flies under a lot of people's radars because they don't even know that it exists because the engine just thinks it's so silly. The engine doesn't take it seriously, so as a result, many people don't know about it. So white played knight f3, most common move, fairly principled move, just developing. I now play pawn to d5, and the engine hates this move, but it's actually very hard to find the refutation for this move over the board. In fact, from what I remember, the refutation is actually very complicated. And this whole idea of knight b6 and d5, I'm not even sure if this variation even has a name yet. Like, I've seen it called the Westerinen variation after the Finnish Grandmaster Heikki Westerinen. But I like to jokingly call it the Alekhine Super French because of the idea behind it. The idea behind it is actually really funny. So white now played bishop to d3, another very principled move, just developing the bishop and taking away the f5 square from my bishop, like grabbing this very nice active diagonal. And I now play bishop to g4. Basically, I'm getting this bishop out immediately because, I've got sort of an evil plan up my sleeves. My opponent castled, and now we see the idea. The idea is to play kind of an improved French defense. This kind of looks like an advanced variation, except somehow the light squared bishop has teleported outside of the pawn structure. And if you ask any French defense player, they would love to have solved that problem. They would love to get their bishop out. They probably wouldn't be too crazy about this really weird knight sitting on b6. Like, how on earth did that knight get over there? but they would love the fact that the bishop is no longer a problem. Like the weird knight, I think that's part of the reason why the engine hates this position, from what I remember. But like I've played this line a few times in rapid games and gotten very good results, and it's just a lot of fun, and it's just something that can really confuse your opponent, like especially if they've never seen it before, and especially if they don't know that you play it, and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I chose to bring it to this tournament. And a couple of things I should note before continuing is if instead my opponent played a move that's much more critical, which is pawn to h3, it's actually very important that black immediately just takes the knight on f3. It's very important that black does this and then plays pawn to e6. The reason why is if you go bishop h5, then white actually has some nasty ideas of playing pawn to e6 themselves. Like, this pawn sacrifice is actually a common theme in a lot of anti-Alekhine lines, in a lot of positions where white plays correctly and black plays incorrectly, and white just busts the Alekhine. Like, this idea of sacking on e6, and black more or less has to take, because pushing the f-pawn's no good. It just leaves this annoying pawn here. Part of the idea of this is just that this bishop can't ever really get out. This knight wants to come here. In fact, before doing this sack, I think the engine says that white should play pawn to g4 first, just to enable this knight to land here. Like, if bishop drops back, it's fine to trade and then push the pawn, stuff like that. But that is why if white plays pawn to h3, you take. That is part of the idea here. And there's some other stuff to talk about as well, but that's not what this recap is going to be about. It's not going to be all about this opening. So anyway, back to the game. Instead of playing h3, my opponent played castle's kingside. I now played pawn to e6, and since the pawn is on e6, if my opponent now plays pawn to h3, I can retreat the bishop. I don't have to trade it. Anyway, my opponent now played pawn to c3, which is okay, but I'm not that crazy about it, since I wasn't immediately pressurizing this pawn. Like, I think bishop to e3 is more normal and is better in my opinion, although this is still a fairly weird line. Like, c3 is not losing. I just didn't really like this move that much. I played pawn to c5 now. Like, things are looking more and more like an advanced variation. Although now my opponent played d takes c5, and I really wasn't expecting this move. I was actually kind of confused by it, because basically it really weakens the pawn on e5, and it lets me develop my dark square bishop to a square where it wanted to go. Like, it's very happy to be on this diagonal. So I was kind of confused by d takes c5. Like, it just seems like a positional mistake. Like, we kind of already see from the engine evaluation that white's advantage is starting to vanish. It's just going away. The engine's no longer laughing at black's opening. The engine's now like, okay, yeah, everything looks fine. Like, it looks like black is kind of equalized now. White played rook e1, reasonable move, just developing. I played knight c6, also developing. I'm not sure yet where I want a castle. I'm still keeping that in the air, so I'm developing other things. We have knight bd2, protecting this knight over here. And I now play knight d7, because the knight is kind of awkwardly placed on b6. But over here on d7, it's helping apply some pressure to the pawn on e5. Note that the knight on f3 is pinned, so I'm pretty happy to, just grab the pawn. Opponent played knight to b3. The engine doesn't like this. In fact, the engine actually sees a very cool idea that both myself and my opponent missed, which is this queen a4 idea, bringing the queen out, breaking the pin, like, kind of justifying knight bd2, and then after bishop to h5, putting the queen on f4. Or, like, this is a weird idea, but I like it. Like, I'm not sure what I would do next. Maybe play pawn to h6, try to play for g5 or something like that. I don't know, but this is what the engine likes, and I do think it is kind of cool. Well, but that's not what happened in the game. Instead, what happened in the game was we had knight to b3, knight comes here to attack my bishop, and I immediately saw something cool that I could do. I played bishop takes f3. The engine doesn't like this idea, but I think humans, like, as from a practical standpoint, I think this was a good idea. This made a lot of sense just from practical point of view, because the idea is that white can't take back with their queen. If white takes back with their queen, I can take this pawn for free. Like, white moves their queen somewhere, say to g3, being like, oh, I will attack this pawn. I'm like, okay, I'll take your bishop. And my opponent doesn't have time to take my bishop because my knights will, just take back. And all that kind of stuff. And queen takes pawn isn't so great either. Like, queen takes g7, counterattacking on my rook, that's not really all that great either. Like, this knight's just, hitting too many things at the same time. So, oh yeah, that's why the opponent can't take back with the queen. My opponent took back with the pawn, so the engine thinks that this is fine, but after letting it think for a bit, it kind of changed its mind. And I should just show that the engine does not really approve of queen takes, so the evaluation going from 0.5 or 0.3 or whatever back to close to a pawn up kind of suggests that the move is not an inaccuracy. At least not an inaccuracy if you're a human. If you're a supercomputer, everything's an inaccuracy. Anyway, a bishop to b6. We have pawn to f4 because this pawn was under attack. Queen to h4, developing my queen, hitting the pawn on f2. Bishop and queen are working together. Queen to f3. I now decide to castle queenside because we've got a nice, juicy open file we can maybe make use of for, opposite side castling attack, whereas it's actually kind of unclear yet how my opponent would attack me on the queen side. Like I've got this file over here, but that's not as much as a problem, especially if I'm able to play king b8 at some point and just put a rook on this file. So anyway, we have pawn to a4. I decided to play pawn to a6. Engine wants me to be braver than this. The engine's like, nah, you can just play, your move right away. There's no time for pawn to a5. There's some really sharp stuff. And I'm thinking maybe part of the idea was maybe play pawn to g4 and then retreat the bishop or something like that. I should actually double check what the idea here is. Like, if white tries this. Oh wow! Could you just sack the bishop? Crazy. After this, oh my! I am not an engine. I did not see all this stuff. This is very bold though, and kind of cool. But I guess part of the idea is to put the pawn on f3, and there's a mate here somewhere. We just need to find it. And pawn to f3, queen gets in here. Oh my. I did not see all that. I should... maybe if I played more blitz games, I would be more inclined to play like that. But anyway, I just played a6. A bit more principled, a bit less, precise, I guess, is what I should say. But the moves I'm making are fine. Bishop to e3, bishop takes. Opponent took with the rook because they missed, my next idea. My next idea was to now play pawn to g5, and white's center comes apart. Alright, the engine wants to take with the pawn, but I would still just play this move here in either case. White can hold things together with precise play, but it's still a very uncomfortable position to be playing and all that. So we have rook takes e3. I play the move that my opponent missed. my opponent tries the most resilient approach, which involves trading the queens off the board. This is a very good idea just because my attack will very clearly arrive much faster than any attack my opponent has on the queen side. So I now take this pawn on, yum, yum, yum. We have queen to g3, queen takes g3 check, pawn takes g3, knight takes d3, rook takes d3, and in this position I could grab this pawn. In fact, I haven't even checked what the engine thinks of this. What does the engine think of this idea? Oh yeah, the engine's like, yeah, this is fine. But instead, I decided to play a little bit more positionally, like play more for piece activity. I play knight e5. We have rook e3. The rook doesn't have a whole lot of good squares to go to. Like if it went to d4 or d2, I just come in with check. And going back to d1, I remember there was something bad about that as well. I think I would still just go knight c4. I go knight c4. We have rook e2. I now play pawn to e5. Like part of the idea of this, like moving this knight around and like this, is the knight gets to a good square and I can push my pawn. I now have these two strong central pawns that can help me take control of the center. Maybe I can make a passed pawn from these guys, stuff like that, like push this e guy, push the d pawn down the board. We have knight to c5, bring my rook to e8, king to g2. Now we see a bit of a cool idea. I play pawn to h5, rook to h1, pawn to h4. This is kind of a positional pawn sacrifice, but I was already up a pawn to begin with, so I'm kind of less scared of these sort of sacrifices. Like, part of the idea is to just really mess up the opponent's pawn structure and also open their king up a bit, because even though this is an endgame, when there are two rooks on the board, or launching a successful mating attack against the opponent's king is more possible. Like, it's not always possible, but it's more possible, more likely to work. Anyway, I play pawn to e4, or like freeing up this rook from the defense of this pawn, and also the knight, and stuff like that. And also just taking some space, taking the d3 square away from this knight, good stuff like that. We have rook h7, trying to go for some active play, for some active counterplay. I play rook g8 check. We have king f1. And here I made a move that was a bit inaccurate. Like here, best move for black is actually just to go rook h8. Like if I had seen this idea, like if I had seen what to do after rook takes f7, I probably would have actually played this move, just because getting rid of white's best piece makes a lot of sense, and I would still, be keeping an active rook this way. Like, basically, the idea is after rook takes f7, I would play rook to g8, like the other rook to g8, and I would be threatening checkmate. There's only one way to stop mate that doesn't immediately lose material, and that would be rook to e1. And then here, after knight to e5, I would be hitting this rook. And basically, the idea is that this knight would be able to go to d3 and essentially fork these two pieces, because basically, let's see, do I remember this right? Trying to remember. Yeah, basically, if the pawn lands on d3, then there's either going to be mates, or at the very least doubling of the rooks on the 7th rank, and things just get very nasty and all that kind of stuff. Let's see, where does this rook even go? That's another question. Where does the rook even go? Like, let's see, something like rook here maybe, because if the rook goes here, then when the knight is removed, the rook will be hanging. And then I think the idea was it rook d, knight d3? I think the knight can actually just go to f3 and win material that way, since, let's see, if the rook moves to there, oh, the rook can't move there. Yeah, okay. Knight goes here. Let's just ask the engine. Engine says knight d3, hitting both of these guys. So these pieces are forked. Let's just say white plays the most intuitive move. And we have f4. Oh, and then just push the pawn. Okay, then d2. And yeah, this is awful because rook check is incoming and then can promote. That was my very, very sharp stuff. Anyway, back to the game. That is not what happened in the game. I did not find this very cool rook to h8 idea with all this stuff. Instead, I just played the more intuitive knight to e5 move, just defending this pawn over here, maybe getting ready to put the knight on f3, do some very nasty things. In fact, knight f3 kind of almost threatens mate if the rook couldn't go back to h1 and be very passive and stuff. But my opponent doesn't go for that. In fact, my opponent missed a very cool move, which would have been to just play pawn to f4. I would not be able to take en passant because then my knight would hang. My knight would have to go back to c4 if I recall correctly. And then my opponent might be able to take this pawn over here. But this is not what happened in the game. Instead, my opponent saw these nasty mating ideas with knight going there and rook going there and played king to e1. And I played rook to g5, which I think is an okay move. Although I did have a better move just in the form of playing pawn to d4, stuff like that. Although moves like that can be scary to play. Opponent played f6. Somewhere in the distance, Ben Feingold is screaming in rage. You should never play f6. It is the worst move ever. Okay, well, sometimes you should play f6. This is not one of those times. Anyway. And in this position, this is where I kind of started to go a little wrong. I played rook dg8. This was a bit wrong because this rook, belonged on d8. It was doing a good job just supporting this pawn. In fact, basically everything in the position is kind of pointing to this idea of some sort of central breakthrough occurring at some point. So the rook really belongs more there. The rook isn't really actually doing anything on the g file, so this was silly. Basically, there was actually a very nice little combination in this position. If you want, you can pause the video and try to find it. There's actually a very nice little combination that at the very least will win some material. So I will reveal that combination in 3, 2, 1. So the idea is to give this check first. So only move and then play pawn to d4. And basically we attack this knight, but also some very nasty stuff is going to happen in the form of pawn to d3. The rook doesn't really have any good square to move to. Let's say my opponent put the knight here or some silly square. And then we have this, then whoops. This is checkmate. Whoops. So yeah, this would just be completely winning on the spot if I found this combination. But I didn't. It can be tough to see this kind of stuff, but you should always work on your tactics. As you work more and more on your tactics, you spot this stuff more reliably and more like that. But anyway, I instead played the very silly move rook dg8. The rook does not belong here. The rook was excellently placed on d8. Anyway, my opponent played king to d1. He played rook to f5. Opponent played knight to a4. Or with some ideas of knight b6 check and taking this pawn. I play king to c7, deciding to get my king active, start using my king in the endgame. We have rook to d2, attacking the pawn. King to c6, defending the pawn. Knight to b6, attacking the pawn again. Knight to f3, counterattacking the rook and defending the pawn with my rook. This rook doesn't really have any good squares to go to. If the rook goes to e2, for example, then I will just play rook takes f6, and my position's awesome. My pieces are all, in unison. So what my opponent now did, I think, was a very good choice from a practical point of view, and I think the engine even approves of this idea, even though black is winning according to the engine. Like, the engine doesn't hate this, which is to just sacrifice the knight. Rook takes, king takes, rook takes f7, and here, I start to really misplay the endgame. I played rook to d8, but I should have gone for a much more aggressive, much more active sort of plan, like playing this rook check first, or the king cannot come to e2, otherwise he gets mated, so it has to go to c2, and then have the king and knight work together to win this pawn, and basically have these pieces help promote this pawn and stuff like that. Like, bring the rook back to f1, take this guy with check, all that kind of stuff. The rook can hit the pawn from behind. Like, very often, rooks belong behind passed pawns, and that's true of opponent passed pawns as well. Like, it's much easier to stop a passed pawn from behind than it is from in front. But anyway, this is not what happened in the game. Instead, I put the rook on d8, playing for some discoveries or something, but this move really didn't make much sense. We have king to e2, rook to d6, just trying to get rid of this pawn. But giving up this pawn was not so good, especially with the king coming here to defend this pawn now. Rook takes f6. An important thing to note is that both my opponent and I, we were starting to really get low on time. This was a very long game, and I did not play the endgame well. We have pawn to b4, king to d5, rook to c7, knight to h3, trying to win this pawn, rook to c5, check, king to d6, c4. My opponent is advancing their majority. Knight takes f2. Engine doesn't like this, wants rook f3 first. I haven't fully looked at the reason why. Anyway, rook d5 check, king to c7, rook to c5 check, king to b7, rook to e5, knight to h1, b5. And a cool little thing here is the opponent cannot take this pawn because the knight can come with check and fork the king and rook. Knight g3 check, king to e3. Engine doesn't like this because it allows the rook to come here and help support the pawn and all that kind of stuff. So rook to f3 check, king to d4. And here I could have actually just played e3 right away, and I really should have. Here I'm actually winning, but we're both in time trouble. We're both playing our moves fairly quickly. We don't have much time to think, but I should have just played pawn to e3, pawn to e2. My pawn arrives faster than these pawns. The king cannot stop up the pawns, but instead I played this move, which was unnecessary and helps my opponent with their plan, which is to promote a pawn over here. So after a takes b5, rook e7 check, forcing my king back. C takes b5, e3, a6, rook a3, a7, and here I made the losing move. Yes, I somehow found a way to lose this game. I played the move e2, which loses. I should have instead played knight to f5, which would have probably resulted in a draw, since the rook cannot both stay on this pawn while defending this pawn. And, if my opponent plays rook here, check, and king comes here and then promotes this pawn, take, then, I think I'll be able to promote this pawn or something, or at least get the king there. The engine itself isn't fully sure about this position. It doesn't seem to have it in its table bases or something. But anyway, this is not what happened in the game. Instead, I played e2, which was a blunder, which was the losing move. Just pawn to b6. My opponent isn't scared of this pawn. My opponent's just going to sack their rook for it. King to d8, rook takes pawn, knight takes rook, pawn to b7, and in this position I resign because there is no way to stop, at least one queen. from manifesting and me losing, my rook and probably also my knight. And this game was just very, very brutal. Oh, like I was winning for a very, very large portion of the game, but that's how chess is. Like really, it's the last mistake, like the last big mistake that loses the game. It doesn't matter like what was happening before that. All that matters is what is happening now. Oh, and all that kind of stuff. And I was a bit unhappy with the results of this game. Like this game was probably the only game where I was unhappy with the results. But my credit to my opponent. My opponent played well and managed to find very good resources. In a losing position, and that's something that separates stronger players from weaker players is being able to salvage like draws or wins from positions where you're losing. But from this game, what I see is that like one piece of feedback I was seeing from the game is that my openings are actually working very well. That I'm actually getting very pleasant positions out of the opening, and I'm actually playing the middle games okay as well. It's more my end games where I'm really making some very serious mistakes. And also maybe my time management a little, like maybe work a bit more on my tactics just so that I can move faster or move more with confidence and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, this was a very brutal round two. I nearly beat a higher rated opponent, but I did not. And yeah, on to round three. Welcome to round three. So, going into this game, I was a bit unhappy with the round two result, so I tried to redeem myself. So, and in this game, I kind of did. I actually played quite well. And for this game, my opponent was a player from my local club. And it was actually kind of funny since we hadn't actually gotten a chance to play against each other at my local club, which is the Annex Chess Club. And even though uh, even though we were always playing in the same section, so this was pretty funny. I mean, since it's like, oh, we finally get a chance to play against each other. This will be interesting. Let's see how it goes. And without further ado, I guess, so let's get on with the game. So the game began with the moves. Let's see, e4, knight f6. So I just brought out my trusty Alekhine again, and like the Alekhine is one of my favorite openings, and like even though I do know other things against e4, I just wanted to keep my repertoire simple for this tournament. I wasn't going super serious or anything like that. Just getting some data, getting some experience, all that kind of stuff. My opponent played e5, best move. Played knight d5. And here my opponent played c4, which is actually an okay move, even though the engine considers it to be inaccurate. Like, there actually isn't anything wrong with c4, since it will very often just transpose to another line, and that did occur in this game. Like, the engine's really picky and wants d4 on move 2, but it's, you can, what's it called? You can kind of get this, the opening, like, the variation that we're going to get in this game from the d4 move order as well. So I played knight b6. My opponent now plays d4. Notice that it makes very little difference, like which one of these pawns comes first. There's like, there are a few move order tricks and things like that, but generally if you're going for the line that my opponent went for in this game, which is, a very, very decent line to play against the Alekhine, you usually do just play c4 on move 3 because it's a little bit more forcing and more like gives black less options to do something weird. Anyway, so my opponent played d4. I now played d6, challenging the center. Her threatening to play d takes e5, and then after d takes e5, queen takes d1 with check, getting rid of white's castling rights. So my opponent stopped that by playing f4. There are actually a number of choices that white can play. Like, one unimportant choice to know about is e takes d6, which in the database is actually more popular than f4, but f4 in my opinion is actually the better move and is more challenging. Like, e takes d6 can actually just lead to a very equal position after black plays e takes d6. Alternatively, black can also play c takes d6 to, keep the position very dynamic and very interesting. So it kind of gives black a fair amount of choice of, do you want something that's just very equal after ed, or do you want something weird after cd, e takes d6, e takes d6 is called the symmetric exchange variation, and like many exchange variations, it's pretty equal, but it's not as dry as, say, the exchange French is. Like, there's still a number of imbalances on the board. And ED-CD is called the asymmetrical exchange variation, and things often get a little weird in that line, but if black knows it very well and white doesn't know it so well, the asymmetric exchange variation can actually be a very good choice. So it can actually make sense to learn both of these lines and basically take a look at what your opponent knows ahead of time and be like, aha, they don't have much experience facing the asymmetric. I will play that, stuff like that. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, my opponent played f4, which is a very challenging line for black to deal with, like a very critical line. This is the 4 pawns attack, and obviously it is named after Mr. Attack. And basically, in this line, white is building a very big pawn center, and black is counterattacking this pawn center, like putting pressure on it. And we kind of have this very interesting battle of principles, battle of ideas. It's kind of like a battle of classical or traditional style versus hyper-modern style, where the traditional style says, oh, you should put pawns in the center, you should control the center with your pawns, whereas hyper-modern style says, you don't necessarily need to put pawns in the center, you can control the center with your pieces. And f4 is a very good line, but it's also a very complicated line, very theoretical one. Like, white has to be ready for quite a few different possibilities that black can play. In fact, there's even more than the 3 listed here. In fact, d takes e5, which is what I played in the game, that possibility even branches off a few different ways. So in the game, I just played d takes e5. My opponent took back with the f-pawn, not taking back with the d-pawn, because, remember, of the queen problem, like queen takes d1 check would be bad. Yeah, my opponent should not allow that. So my opponent took back with the f-pawn, and here there are again still a number of choices for black to make here. But I played knight to c6, which, in my opinion, is one of the better choices and also one of the easier choices to learn. Like, these days, knight c6 has kind of fallen a bit out of fashion just because like, theory kind of advanced a bit, and if white plays perfectly, there are ways that white can just kind of neutralize everything that black does. Like, these days, before d takes e5, g6 has been becoming more popular, but openings come and go, and in my opinion, knight c6 is fine. Like, especially at my level, it's, just very easy to understand and very intuitive to play. Like, very easy for black to find the moves. Like, you just kind of learn a few general rules, a few general principles, and away you go. So basically, in this position, black is now attacking the pawn on d4. White needs to react to this somehow. And my opponent played the best move here. Many players, like, especially in rapid games that I've played, will often go wrong here. I've even seen titled players go a bit wrong here, and they'll play the move knight to f3. And basically, this is not good because after bishop g4, black is basically applying so much pressure on white's position that white's advantage from the opening actually vanishes. Like, if we turn on the engine now, it's 0-0. which can either mean equal position or the engine doesn't know what on earth is going on. Like, basically, knight f3 is kind of a positional blunder in a sense. And it's like, it just gives black way too much initiative. Black is just allowed to put so much pressure on white's center and try to break it down. But that's not what happened in the game. Credit to my opponent. My opponent probably, actually studied this line, actually learned this line, and played the correct move, which is bishop to e3. Defending the pawn this way and not allowing bishop g4 to be played. And in this position, black has nothing better to do than to develop this bishop. So I play bishop to f5. The bishop can't go to g4 because the queen covers that square. My opponent now plays knight to c3. One idea for white in this line is to try to play for the d5 push. Like, basically, if white can get in d5, then that can be very, very good. Like, these central pawns can basically push my pieces back and blow me off the board. Or, like, currently, white cannot do that because the e5 pawn would hang, but it is a move that white is often playing for. So I play e6. Like, part of the reason to get the bishop out is so that the e6 pawn does not block it, like, does not keep it trapped behind your pawn structure. My opponent now plays knight to f3, just developing. I now play bishop to b4. This is generally where this bishop should go in this line in the four pawns attack. Like, if my opponent had played a3 instead of knight to f3, then I would just put the bishop on e7 instead and basically be like, yeah, that a3 move was kind of a waste of time, kind of stuff like that. Just develop the bishop elsewhere, maybe play f6 at some point and take back with the bishop, stuff like that. And so here, after playing bishop to b4, I'm pinning the knight, and I'm also threatening to double my opponent's pawns. And my opponent played rook to c1, which is kind of a rare move, but it is one that I looked at. And here, I knew that the best move for black to play is to play the move bishop to g4, and basically argue that the move rook to c1 is actually very silly, that it was actually a waste of time. I'm like, let's see, I'm trying to remember what was the best move in this position. I think bishop e2 is actually the normal move, but that's not what happened in the game. So we have rook c1, bishop to g4, and part of the idea here is, like, I can afford to, kind of burn a tempo, like having moved this bishop twice, because basically I'm going to be arguing that this tempo here, rook c1, is actually useless. It's like here, there's just so much pressure on white's position. Like, I'm currently threatening to do something like bishop takes f3, and then if queen takes f3, knight takes d4 is possible. Like, queen takes b7 is possible as well, but, destroying white's center is more important than the pawn on b7. And, like, basically, if white's center is destroyed, white kind of loses their advantage in this opening, and my pieces would just be very, very active and very happy. And if my opponent takes back with the pawn, there's ideas of playing queen to h4 check, and even if my opponent blocks with their bishop, I can still put the queen on f4 or something like that, and just have an active queen and just be, very annoying. Like, basically notice that I'm getting all of my pieces out, and my pieces are very active. I don't have much pawns in the center, but I do have control of the center via my pieces. So this is kind of a very hyper-modern playing style. So my opponent did not find the best move here, and I don't blame them. Like, it can be hard to figure that out. Like, this is a very sharp variation, very sharp line, very theoretical, very challenging for white to keep their advantage because there is so much stuff that black can play against you. Like, so many possibilities. These, like, grandmasters, they're like, oh, it's effortless for us. We just memorize everything. But, at my level, it kind of makes sense that my opponent would not know the next move. Like, we're actually at move 10 right now. So the next move for my opponent, like, the next move move, in theory, is a3, and then after bishop takes c3 check, opponent has to take back with the b pawn. This is part of the idea of this bishop move, because it makes the rook move look really funny. Like, the rook's just behind a couple of c pawns now. Like, what is this rook even doing on this file now? Rook c1 looks like a waste of time, whereas bishop g4 looks like, a good spot for the bishop. Like, the issue with taking back with the rook is that basically this is possible, and my opponent would have to take back with the pawn or something, and otherwise my opponent's going to lose this pawn, as I mentioned before, and that's no fun. And like, my opponent's going to lose their advantage. So that's why my opponent would have to take back with the pawn, because they would have to take back with the pawn over here alternatively, and that's not so fun either with the queen h4 idea. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, what happened was we had queen d2. Part of the idea of this move was to maybe put the queen on f2 if my queen tries coming to h4. But part of the problem with queen to d2 is it just allows me to take the knight over here and get rid of, like, basically bring this pawn to f3. And now I played pawn to f6. This is a common pawn break in the 4 pawns attack. Like, basically, I'm trying to destroy white's center. My opponent plays f4, trying to maintain their center. And here, this position, I probably should have actually played queen to e7. I think that would have been a bit of a better move, like queen to e7, and then maybe castle queenside, or bring the rook to d8, keep the pressure up this way. Hey, like, I think I should have kept the tension here. But the move I played in the game was okay, too. Like, I played f takes e5. My opponent took back with the d pawn. And the center is kind of coming apart now. Now the pawn on f4 is a potential weakness since it's a backward pawn. I now play queen to e7. Since I don't really want to trade queens here, my opponent's king is still in the center, whereas my king, is fairly happy to castle and stuff like that. My opponent plays a3, and here I made a minor positional inaccuracy. I played bishop to c5, trading this bishop for that bishop. What I should have done was actually just take the knight, right, and just keep the tension going, or... Oh, wow, this is... Oh, I see. No, I shouldn't have taken the knight. I should have moved the rook first. Like, move the rook here, and then after queen f2, taking away the c5 square from the bishop, then take the knight. Yeah, okay. And then here, like, basically, I would just have very strong pieces, very active pieces. Rook d3, castle kingside, stuff like this. Like, I was a bit hesitant to do all this because it would mean that my opponent has the bishop pair and I have no bishops. But I think this can be justified just due to the fact that I've got so much pressure on my opponent's position. Like currently, knight takes this pawn is a possibility. This is a threat, after I castle, and my opponent has to deal with that. My opponent has to deal with all of these nasty threats I've got on the board, and basically I've got a nice lead in development. My king is castled, all my pieces are developed. My opponent still hasn't developed these two pieces, and their king is still in the center. So this would have been a better way for me to play in the game, but that's not what happened in the game. Instead, I played bishop to c5, which is just a little bit inaccurate. Like, there is some justification here, which is that my opponent has the bishop pair, and I want to just get rid of one of those bishops and weaken it. But, piece activity is kind of more important than long-term positional advantages, is at times. Like, very often, I should say, very often, piece activity and king safety are more important than this long-term stuff. But, like, more important than bishop pair, more important than pawn structure, even sometimes more important than material. Anyway, my opponent played b4, kind of forcing the trade, but I'm kind of happy with this trade anyway. Takes. I now get my king to safety. I now castle. If I castle queenside, that actually looks pretty risky just because there are all these pawns already on the way. Like there's already a pawn storm in motion, so it makes sense to castle here. Currently, I've got a bit of an issue with the e-pawn being isolated, but my opponent's got an issue with a backward f-pawn, and their bishop can't defend it. Like the bishop can support the f5 square, but I've got the f5 square very well defended. My opponent now plays queen to g3. The engine doesn't quite like this. It thinks pawn to c5 would have been better. I don't quite understand the idea, but let's just take a look. Like, I would play knight d5, like, c5 did eventually happen in the game, and I did do this just because this would result in a passed pawn, and also the pawn no longer being isolated. I have bishop e2, queen e6, castle, knight e7, you know, supporting this square, and also potentially doing this to support the pawn. One opponent could now play c6, okay. B takes c6, like, this was an idea I consider kind of an interesting pawn sacrifice. Rook c3, rook a d8. Okay, well, this is interesting. I still don't quite understand what the engine is saying. Maybe there's some ideas of playing f5 at some point, but this is not what happened in the game. Instead, the opponent played queen to g3, and here I played knight d4, and here I do kind of agree with the engine. I should have probably just played pawn to a5. I've just tried to activate this rook since all of my other pieces are kind of in the game, and if I can play a takes b4, the rook, you know, comes out, and I'm totally fine with b5 because that creates some weaknesses as well. Like, in particular, the a3 pawn would be under fire from my queen. So here I do agree with the engine. I do like this suggestion by the engine of playing a5, but that's not what happened in the game. Instead, opponent played queen g3, and I played knight d4, just, you know, trying to bring my knight over to the king side because there's probably going to be some play here. There's this nasty open file I've got to be mindful of. My opponent's probably going to try to attack me. Also, I want to, you know, control the square in front of this pawn. Opponent plays pawn to c5. I start bringing my other knight over. My opponent decides to trade. I'm happy with this trade since I no longer have an isolated pawn. Although this trade is still a little double-edged because it does result in this guy becoming a passed pawn. So I've got a passed pawn as well. And the king is still, for the time being, in the center. Bishop to d3, pawn to c6, just supporting this pawn. Also, have to be careful of this diagonal since I have pushed my f-pawn. We have queen to g3, threatening checkmate in 1. I play pawn to g6, blocking mate in 1, and also adding some more control to this square. There we have castle's kingside. I think my opponent was considering going like rook g1 or something, but I think we looked at the game afterwards, and I think we decided, or basically determined afterwards, that rook g1, like, the attack would not work, that I would just have too much of a quick counterattack on my opponent's king in the center. So castling makes sense. And here I go for the a5 idea. Like, basically, in this position, all of my pieces are participating except for this rook. Like, very often, like, in puzzles involving positional play, like, very often the best move is to improve your worst piece. Like, I could have brought my rook to e8, but that kind of felt a bit wrong since, you know, these pawns kind of do a good job of just blocking my rooks. So I'm like, let's try to get in a different way. Okay, and here I was actually thinking my opponent would try playing a move like pawn to b5, basically sacrificing this pawn to keep my rook, you know, stuck within here. But pawn to b5 is okay, but it's not super great. And it kind of does just kind of look like giving up a pawn without enough justification. Like, maybe I should look a little at that line. Like, pawn to b5. What's interesting is that the engine's top move is rook f7, not even taking it. Although c takes b5 or knight takes b5, those moves are playable. Or, like, basically, I would probably take with the knight, because that would essentially force this trade, because otherwise I would just move my knights back, or back to c7 or something, and it would just be an unjustified pawn sacrifice. So we would have this, and then opponent would probably play maybe queen d3 or queen b3, something like that. And we would just kind of have a different game, I see. Okay, like, I would probably end up losing one of these two pawns in some way. Okay, and yeah, okay, this is not what happened in the game, but this is interesting. The engine gives me a slight edge here, but this is just way too different from the game. And so instead of playing b5, which I thought, would be an interesting move is worth consideration, my opponent just plays rook f2, who is kind of getting a little bit too aggressive on the king side and stuff. Like, basically, I don't think... Like, I never really felt that the king side attack would work. I felt that I would be able to get my pieces. Like, I've got too many pieces over here already helping me defend. So I'm like, yeah, okay, you can do your rook f2 stuff. I'm not too bothered by that. We have a takes b4, a takes b4, and now I play rook a3, activating my rook this way, pinning the bishop to the queen. Just a very annoying rook. Look, I quite like this. And my opponent was now very, very low on time. In fact, as early as move 10, and like right at move 10, right all the way back in this position over here, my opponent had actually spent like either 20 or 30 minutes just on this move, like just on the move queen to d2, because this position is just so complicated. Whereas I had spent like 5 minutes just looking at the position and thinking, okay, I think the move is bishop g4. I should just, kind of, do a little bit of calculation and just remind myself of what the idea is behind bishop to g4 is, stuff like that. So basically, as early as move 10, I had taken a very big time lead in this game. So in this position, my opponent was already in time trouble, whereas I still had a very good amount of time left on my clock. I think it was something like I had 25 minutes, my opponent had 10, something of that sort. So my opponent now blundered with the move rook to d1, and if you want, you can now pause the video and try to find the move that I now played. It's a tactic. It's a tactic. I will reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. So the move that I now played is rook takes f4, and my opponent's position now just starts to completely come apart. Because if my opponent would now play rook takes f4, then I have the move knight to e2 check, forking the king and rook, and bishop takes e2 isn't really possible because I could then just take the queen and I would have traded rook and knight for the queen. And that's a favorable trade here, especially since my opponent's king is exposed. And my king is not. So basically, my opponent would move the king somewhere. Like, the engine really does not like this position. In fact, the engine seems to think going for that trade is best. But if, say, king h1, then knight takes f4 is quite nasty. Like, basically, this pawn is now very weak and is probably going to fall at some point. My opponent's king is exposed. My king is okay. Like, queen to c8 check does nothing. I can just, move my king like this. And, yeah, both this bishop and this pawn would now be under attack. Although, I guess maybe I can't quite take the pawn because this pawn could be taken, but basically, my king is safer and my pieces are more active, and this position would be just very pleasant for me. I would be quite happy with this position, but this is not what happened in the game. My opponent probably saw all this and decided to do something else. My opponent tried to maybe keep some chances on the board, maybe try to keep this attack going with rook to g2, but sadly, my king is actually safer than my opponent's king. I play knight to f3 check. Opponent plays king to h1. I take this pawn, and now I'm just quite happy with this position because this pawn is just a monster. This pawn is just a constant thorn in my opponent's side. Like, if I just trade all the pieces off the board, this is just a winning king and pawn endgame. And this pawn is just annoying, for the opponent to deal with. And also in this position, if queen c8 check, I don't have to block with my queen. I could even play king g7. I could also just bring the rook back to f8. So I'm not too scared of queen coming like here. And one thing that's cool about this knight move is that the knight is defending this pawn, so even sacrifices on g6 don't really work. Like here it wouldn't really work because the bishop's pinned to the queen, but still, like just my position is just awesome. So we have rook g3, and I decide to simplify here. I play knight takes d3, opponent takes with the g rook. I give this check. We have king g1. I take, my opponent takes, and I considered trading queens and going into the rook endgame. Like, that was my original plan. But then, I thought for a couple of minutes, and I was like, oh, wait, I just have something much better than doing that in this position. So the way that the game ended was I played rook to g4 check, and according to the engine, the best move for my opponent is queen to g3, just giving up the queen for the rook. That's very painful. My opponent played king to f1, probably hoping that I didn't, see good way to end the game. I played queen to g2 check. The engine considers this a blunder. This is not a real blunder. Opponent plays king to e1, only move they had available. I play rook to e4 check. And, as I often say, resigns in 2 is better than mate in 4. Or my opponent has no choice but to give up their queen, and my opponent is in time trouble. And it was in this position that my opponent decided to resign, and I don't blame them. This is a good place to resign. And yeah, I'm actually very happy with how I played this game. Like, playing bishop to c5 earlier on, like trading my dark square bishop for my opponent's dark square bishop, that was a bit of a positional inaccuracy, but it wasn't a serious mistake. Like, I played the opening very well, and just throughout this whole game, like, past move 10, I was never losing. I was never really in any trouble. Or, like, basically, when I played bishop c5, the engine gives my opponent a very slight advantage if they play accurately. But, after that, I was just always, at the very least, slightly better. So I'm quite happy with this game and with this win. And yeah, that was round 3. On to round 4. Welcome to round 4. So, going into this game, I was very excited since the pairings actually were posted in the evening of round 3. Like, with this tournament, we had round 1 on a Friday evening, round 2 and 3 on a Saturday, and round 4 and 5 on a Sunday. So they posted the pairings for round 4 or like Saturday evening, and when I saw who I was playing against, I was pretty excited. Like, I'm like, oh my, I think this might actually be, a titled player there. I think that my opponent might actually be a national master, since like, I've seen it mentioned on Wikipedia as well as elsewhere. Like, basically, I've seen it mentioned that my opponent, at least at one point in time, met the requirements to be a national master, and basically, if he doesn't have that title, it's probably just because he doesn't want it. So I was really excited for that. And going into the game, I was thinking to myself, well, should I actually play the bird like I played in round 1? So I looked at some of my opponent's recent games in the database, and I came to the conclusion that yes, I absolutely should play the bird. Playing the bird is correct here. And you might be wondering why. Like, how can I tell whether the bird would be a good choice? And the answer is that, if you remember, the bird is kind of like a Dutch defense, but with the colors reversed. And one way to tell whether the bird will be a good matchup against your opponent is by looking at what your opponent plays with the white pieces. And what I found is that my opponent plays e4 or with white, right, almost exclusively. Like, basically every game that I found, they played e4 on move 1. And then, of course, the next thing to check is, well, what if my opponent, plays f5 against d4? What if my opponent plays the Dutch defense? Then they would have, experience, like, at least with the Dutch/bird side, so they'll at least know what my plans are, what I am trying to do, and what generally works well against them. And so I checked that as well and found that no, they do not play the Dutch themselves. Oh, so that's a good thing as well. What I also found is that against e4, they do a lot of e4, e5. And I'm like, okay, so that does mean that there is a possibility of Fromm's Gambit, because one thing to watch out for if you are going to play Fromm's Gambit, like, from the black side, like, if you yourself are going to be playing Fromm's Gambit, one thing you have to be mindful of is that white has the option of playing e4, and then suddenly you will have a King's Gambit on the board. And suddenly it's black who's under a lot of pressure. It's black who has to worry about the position getting very sharp and complicated and worry about their own king's safety. So I'm like, okay, there's always a possibility that my opponent might play Fromm's Gambits, because if you play e5 against e4, then you probably have some King's Gambit experience, or at the very least you're at the very least prepared to face the King's Gambit if an opponent plays it against you. So basically, the morning of this game, I made sure to review the Fromm's Gambit a little bit, but I also reviewed the main line, like the mainline classical bird, because that's very, very often what your opponent will play if they don't have much experience against the bird/Dutch, but they are still a strong player, because they'll know in theory that this is the best line, but in practice they might not actually know how to play it. So my opponents for this game was Ilya Bluvshtein, who is the father of Mark Bluvshtein, who is a former Canadian prodigy. Like, basically, he was a Canadian player who became a grandmaster as a teenager. I think at one point he was even in the running for youngest grandmaster ever, or something like that. I might be wrong about that. I'd have to double check. But anyway, yeah, I was really looking forward to this game because, from my understanding, my opponent is either a national master or at least as strong as a national master, like has the playing strength of one. And yeah, from this game, my opponent did not disappoint. They definitely played like one. And so, without further ado, let's get on with the game. So, as mentioned before, I determined that morning that bird's opening would be a very good choice. My opponent played d5, as I expected them to. I played knight f3. My opponent played c5. Nothing too weird so far. Like, usually I'll see knight f6, g6, bishop g7 first, but, actually, no, I'm wrong about that. At d4 and c4, that is often played. So, nothing weird so far. This is normal. I played e3, and now an important little detail is that if the opponent now plays knight c6, then I would consider playing bishop to b5, which is kind of a Nimzo Dutch. Like, you can sometimes end up transposing to favorable lines in the Nimzo Indian, because sometimes in the Nimzo Indian defense, you actually do want to get your pawn to f5, and you often end up wasting a tempo, like moving your knight out of the way, playing the pawn there, and then maybe even moving the knight back. So against knight c6, I would consider like playing bishop to b5, and I more or less play it all the time when And when we have the Dutch defense on the board, like when I'm black and my opponent is white, right? Since very often the opponent is playing for pawn to e5, and you really need to stop that. So anyway, that's not what happened in the game. I played e3. My opponent now played g6. So far, nothing unexpected. Bishop to e2. I'm going for the classical Dutch setup. Like, this move kind of telegraphs that I'm not really playing a stone wall, that I'm going for a classical bird. Bishop to g7. Just castle. We have knight to c6. I played d3. Knight to f6. And now, in this position, we kind of have a mainline classical Dutch, except white has an extra tempo. And what I often like to do with the extra tempo is play the move king to h1. This is kind of just a waiting move. Like other moves in the position that could be considered are queen to e1 and pawn to a4. But the problem with pawn to a4 is very often you want to put your knight on a4, like depending on what your opponent has done. Like basically if your opponent ends up with doubled pawns over here, you want the knight to come to a4 and not have the pawn there. And queen to e1 can be a bit premature sometimes, because sometimes you do need to keep the d-pawn defended or the d4 square defended. So I just play king to h1, just waiting and seeing what my opponent is going to do. If my opponent is indeed going to play the main line, my opponent does. And this is basically the main line classical Dutch, but with the colors reversed and with the Dutch player having gotten in the move king to h8 for free. Like, king to h8 is a move that is just nice to have in pretty much every variation or every line that black could play, because you take your king off of this diagonal where very often there could be nasty tactics, like sometimes the queen or bishop could be coming here, stuff like that. So very often this is a very nice move to have. And so I now played the move that you normally play in the mainline classical Dutch, with the king still on g8. I play knight to e5, which is a move that Grandmaster Simon Williams has done a lot of work analyzing. He has basically determined that this is the best move for the Dutch player to play. Okay? And the engine agrees, and I agree as well. Like, just from practice, this is a very good move. Here, the best move for black is actually to take the knights, and then to move their knights to one of these two squares, like, say, knight to e8, 8, and then after pawn to d4, pawn to f6, and then there are a number of things that white could play here. Here, knight to c3 is interesting, for example, and then we just end up with a very complicated, very messy, sharp, dynamic position where it's equal, but there are equal winning chances for both sides, and things just become a mess. Like, there are often ideas of what's it called? Often ideas of white giving up this pawn, but taking this pawn, for example. Well, and I'm not going to go too much into this position. If you do want to learn more about what happens next after this, typically, then I would recommend, again, checking out the chess content created by Ginger GM, created by Grandmaster Simon Williams. He's got an excellent course on Chessable, for example. But this is not what happened in the game. Instead, my opponent played a move that's much more commonly played, which is the move queen to c7. And now I took the knight, and my opponent can take with either the pawn or the queen. Like, I'm ready for either one of those. In the game, my opponent took with the pawn, but if my opponent takes with the queen, then I can either play pawn to a4, or I can even play bishop to f3. Like, one common thing that you're playing for in the classical Dutch / classical bird is you're trying to get in the move pawn to e4, so bishop to f3 would help support that, and then you can play knight to c3. You generally don't play knight to c3 to support this pawn push, but with the bishop on f3 pinning this pawn to the queen, it's now possible. Like, the reason why you don't normally play it is because you don't want your opponent to be able to play pawn to d4 without being able to respond to that with pawn to e4. Like, basically, you do not want to allow this pawn to trade for this pawn, as that would mess up your pawn structure a bit and be positionally bad. Like, I can't fully explain why it's positionally bad, but from experience, I know that it's just very unpleasant. It is not fun. Like, you just have quite a few weaknesses. But this is not what happened in the game. My opponent did not take with the queen, but taking with the queen is a line. It is a possibility. Instead, my opponent took with the pawn, and I said normally that you don't want to play knight c3 because, you know, that allows pawn to d4. But in this case, it's fine because we've got these two doubled isolated pawns here. My opponent doesn't really want to trade this pawn for this pawn because then, you know, these pawns will be weak. Like, basically, the knight will jump here, like, if d4, knight here, takes, I'm very happy with this. Like, even if my opponent, you know, even if my opponent tries harassing my bishop, I can just drop the bishop back to g1, you know, stuff like that, especially since my king is on h1. Again, another reason why this king h8, king h1 move is nice to have, is it frees up the g1 square for this bishop to stay on this nice diagonal. But this is not what happened in the game. This is just a common idea. And if, if instead you can... Sometimes you can even get in the move pawn to e4 and play b3 and maybe rotate the knight back to the c4 square, you know, stuff like that, or maybe play bishop a3. Like, basically, in this kind of line, white, or like basically the bird/Dutch player plays against these weak pawns. So, anyway, in this position, my opponent played a decent move. In fact, I think it might actually be the best move, according to the engine, even though there are 0 games in the Lichess Master database that actually feature it. So my opponent managed to find the best move over the board, which is to play pawn to e5. And as a general rule in the Dutch/bird, like in the classical Dutch/classical bird, you want to be able to meet the move pawn to e4 with your own e-pawn coming forward, or you want to be able to meet this like that, and basically you fight for the center this way. Like, very often in the classical Dutch/Leningrad, you'll want these two friends side by side helping each other out, helping you control the center this way. So anyway, my opponent now played the move bishop to a6, which is not the best move, but you know, it's a decent move. I don't hate this move. The best move is actually, surprisingly enough, e takes f4, but this is a bit unintuitive because I get to develop with tempo. Then after queen here, I would probably maybe try knight a4 and then pawn to c3, you know, something like that, but the engine likes rook b1. But, you know, this is kind of a different game. And so instead, my opponent played bishop to a6, and in this position, I played another idea that you often see in the classical Dutch/bird, which is to make this pawn push to go for this kingside attack, pawn to f5. We have pawn to c4. My opponent's trying to deal with their bad pawn structure, or over here trying to solve some of their problems on the queen side. I'm like, okay, yeah, you can do that. I push my g pawn on. I'm here for a fight. My opponent undoubles their pawns by playing c takes d3. And here, according to the engine, I should have played c takes d3. I instead played bishop takes d3, where the thinking was that by playing pawn to g4, I've kind of created some weaknesses along this diagonal. So I was thinking, maybe I should trade light squared bishops. Then there's, you know, one less piece that can make use of that weakness. But it was probably more correct. Like, it was more correct according to the engine to take with the pawn and keep the bishops on the board. Like, in general, when you're launching an attack, you usually don't want to trade pieces. You want to keep pieces on the board so that you have more ammunition for your attack to work. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, we just traded. I took with the pawn like this. Like, notice that I have very very nice central control, very nice play on the king side. Like, even my pieces over here that aren't developed, they're still kind of indirectly participating. And, like, this bishop is still covering, this square and stuff like that. So, that's pretty cool. Like, very often this bishop in the classical Dutch/bird, very often you keep it back, and it's kind of like a sniper. Like, very often it sacrifices itself for a pawn on h6. It's kind of like in a King's Indian sort of thing. Anyway, my opponent now played the move rook f d8. Just developing their rook, principled move. I played bishop g5, putting some pressure on my opponent. I am, threatening some very nasty stuff. In particular, since the rook is no longer on f8, I'm threatening pawn takes pawn, followed by bishop takes knight, because, f takes pawn would no longer defend the knight, and I've got these two friends ganging up over here, so my opponent has to do something about that. My opponent responds with rook d6, defending the knight this way. I play queen to f3, getting my queen off of this file, also applying some pressure onto the d5 pawn, on maybe getting ready to bring this rook into the game as well. Just a decent move all around. Opponent plays rook to b8. I decide to now take this knight, and I was originally thinking that my opponent might take with the rook, and I haven't actually analyzed that, whether it's good or not. What does the engine think of this? Yeah, taking with the rook is okay. It's about the same as taking with the bishop. Here, let's see, I remember things getting really complicated and really messy, where, I would take this pawn, and I guess, I see, the reason why opponent didn't take with the rook is because taking back with this pawn would potentially allow a fork. But I was kind of looking at some interesting stuff, which doesn't actually seem to be sound, come to think of it, involving opponent taking this pawn, putting the rook on h6, and trying to maybe push this pawn, trying to attack over here. But turns out that doesn't really work. Maybe I can just play rook f2 and just defend everything that way, stuff like that. So this is not what happened in the game. Apparently, according to the engine, just putting the rook back here is fine. And then I would have probably played a move like knight e4, and an engine can probably defend this, but this just looks like a mess. This is a very messy position. So yeah, what my opponent played probably makes a lot more sense just from a human's perspective. And what my opponent played was just taking back with the bishop. So I now took over here. The opponent took with the f-pawn. Normally you should capture towards the center, but I think taking with the f-pawn does make some sense, as maybe my opponent can make use of the file. Also, my opponent probably doesn't want the f7 pawn to be a potential target that I could be attacking, since my pieces are lined up over here. I now have kind of won a pawn, because basically my opponent cannot really take back with the pawn, because taking back with the pawn, this, oopsies, knight is a little drunk apparently, would fork these guys, and would win some material. So this is no good. So I've kind of won a pawn here. Opponent retreats their bishop. I now take over here, and my opponent takes with their queen, pinning my queen to the king. That's something I have to be mindful of. And play knight e4, blockading this pawn, putting my knight on a very nice active square, attacking the rook as well. Opponent plays rook d7, and I originally thought that this move was not possible. Well, I kind of missed a bit of a defensive resource. I was originally thinking that I could play knight f6 check and then take the queen, but I forgot, oh yeah, the queen can just take the knight, and then, we would just have kind of a trade here that ends with my rook here, but then opponent takes this pawn, and, I wasn't too crazy about, how that would look. Maybe I should just show that. So taking with the queen is important, otherwise I play queen takes queen. Queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes, rook takes, and I think this is just very equal or something. My opponent might even have a bit of an advantage just because this rook is out of play. What would the engine say about this? Yeah, the engine says this is equal. Okay. So I did not do this. I do not want to trade the pieces. I want to keep my initiative going. I want to keep attacking. And so anyway, my opponent played rook d7. I did not play knight to f6 check. I just played pawn to b3 since, this rook is attacking the pawn. I want to defend it. And it's, let's see. Opponent now plays rook b d8. The engine doesn't like this. The engine instead likes the move queen to c2. And yeah, I kind of agree. I think this is, a better way to continue, a better way in. And like, I'm not, in too much danger here. Or like, basically the engine wants me to play rook a d1, kind of get the rook off of this diagonal, as well as defend this pawn, since this pawn is much more important than this pawn. In fact, I'm not even sure if my opponent can even take this pawn, since it will be bringing their queen away from, bring their queen away from potential defense of their king, stuff like that. But maybe we should analyze that line. So after queen takes, oh, actually this is playable. It's just, I'll go here, knight c5, and then there would be rook f8, queen c6 maybe, and we would just have very sharp and very complicated position. Queen e6 check, for example. Yeah, this would just be a different game and all that. And let's see. Oh, wow. This gets very complicated, actually. Like rook takes, bishop takes, and even do knight takes here, and then we have a mess. And there might be like a perpetual for black here. Like, black probably wants to do a perpetual just because queen and knights generally coordinate much better than queen and bishop. Up, and let's see. Yeah, either player has a perpetual if they want. Like, this game is at least a draw for either side. Right, so it would kind of just be a mess, but this is not what happened in the game. My opponent did not find queen c2. Instead, my opponent played rook b d8. I now play rook a c1, kicking the queen and, developing my rook. We have queen to b5. And here I decide to go for the attack. I decide to go all in. I play knight f6 check. Sadly, this attack does not quite work. We have bishop takes because knight was, of course, forking the king and rook. So that's why bishop takes is forced. We have rook takes d3, queen e6 check, king h8, and now a very cool move by me, rook to c7. The position is just so sharp, very dangerous, as I'm playing for the win in here, and I'm playing for a win either via kingside attack or via a winning rook endgame, because basically part of the idea of rook to c7 is, even though this diagonal is kind of a weakness, the queen can't really get there. Like, the rook covers these squares, and my queen covers this square. So the queen can't check me along this diagonal. And there's no time for rook d1, because checkmate, So basically I'm going all in. We're both actually pretty low on time, since, this was a very complicated game, very complicated position. And basically, opponent now played rook 3 d6. I have to be very mindful of, queen takes f1 checkmate ideas. I play queen to f7. And then, defending my rook and threatening mate in multiple ways. Opponent played rook 6 d7. And here, I thought down to 1 minute on my clock. I was trying to find a win. Trying desperately to find a win. Apparently, there is no win, and got down to 1 minute. My opponent also had like less than a minute on their clock, and I decided to just bail out. I played the move queen to f6 check and just offered a draw, and my opponent took it. The reason why my opponent took it is because I basically have a perpetual here. Like, I at the very least have a perpetual. Like, we would kind of do back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Or, like, my opponent tries here. This is not a good idea. This looks very dangerous. Like, my opponent probably gets mated if they try this. It's like, I probably have something like on a g5 check, king to here, maybe queen to f3 check now. King has to take the pawn, I think, otherwise he gets mated. Although, like, this is just not something you would play in time trouble, like, not something my opponent should be doing. So, like, I think there's a forced mate here, or something. Or at the very least, an alternative perpetual. Oh, like, let's see. Can I find it? I don't know. Like, maybe this rook check. At the very least, have perpetual here. Probably just rook c4. Like, this probably just wins. Like, there's no rush. Like, let's see. Yeah, my opponent doesn't really have any checks like this since these squares are covered. And yeah, this would probably just be mate now. Yeah, okay. Fairly convinced of that. But this is not what happened in the game. Instead, what happened in the game was I played queen f6 check, offered a draw, and my opponent took it. Okay, since there's just a perpetual from back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Blocking with the rook's not possible. I just take with check. Anyway, this game was brutal. This game took a lot of energy out of me. It was very sharp, very, very complicated. And I was just exhausted. But I was also happy with the results. Like, I was happy to see, how the classical bird did against, a strong opponent. Since I had tried it in rapid, in fact, I had tried the classical bird in a rapid tournament. In fact, it was a team tournament the week before. And in that tournament, my team, everyone was scared. Nobody wanted to play on board one. So I was like, oh, I'm fine with playing on board one. So then I played on board one, and I had white against the 2300, and I played the classical bird against them, and I won that game. And my team was just in shock because we were not expecting, to be beating, strong teams, to be beating strong players at that, rapid tournaments. And there I was winning with some weird opening, and my teammates are like, what was the opening? I've never seen these kind of positions before. What happened? How did this happen? And my opponent at that tournament, who was a strong 2300, well, I should say a 2300 in good form, like he had recently won a tough tournament. He was kind of in shock at the results because, like, the bird is an opening that has a reputation for being garbage, so to lose to the bird is kind of a few orders of magnitude below losing to the bong cloud in, the eyes of strong players. So anyway, that was this game. On to round 5. Welcome to round 5. So going into this round, I was actually very much mentally checked out from the tournament. I was just exhausted. Like, I kind of brought all of my fights to round 4. Like, I was really looking forward to round 4, and I had a great time with that game. But since it ended in a draw, I now had 2.5 points out of 4, which is not a bad score. But part of the issue is that I'm exhausted, and going into the final round, I knew that even if I won this game, even if I finished with 3.5 points out of 5, I would not finish in the top 3. I would not finish on the podium. There would be no prize money for me, because going into the final round, there were already 2 players with 3.5 points out of 4, and there were at least 2 players with 3 points out of 4. I think there might have been 3 or 4 who actually had 3 points out of 4, or something like that. And I basically determined that, okay, yeah, this final game in the grand scheme of the tournament isn't really that important. And also, I'm exhausted. Like people generally really like my playing style of chess. Like, it's very dynamic and very tactical. Very interesting, very creative. But one very serious downside of the way that I play chess is that it's also very exhausting. Like, you often get these very complicated positions where you can play for a win, but where if you're not careful, you'll end up losing the game. So, as a result, many of my games would often go down to the last minute on the clock. Like, like many of my games would end with either myself or my opponent or both of us having 1 minute. Like round one ended with my opponent having 1 minute on the clock and me having 5 minutes. Round two ended with both myself and my opponent having less than a minute on the clock. Round three, round three, I was actually doing okay on time. I think I still had like 10 or 15 minutes left on the clock, while my opponents had 5. Round 4, we both had less than a minute on the clock. So yeah, I was just exhausted going into this final round. And my opponent is another player who goes to my local club, like similar to my round 3 opponent. And that kind of even more like added even more to the mental checkout, because it's like, oh, so, if I mess up this game, I'll still most likely have a chance to play this opponent again some point in the future. So, as a result, I did not play very well this game, although the opening and early middle game are still very interesting, so I think there is still something to show. Like, I did get some very valuable data from this game. Like, I did consider withdrawing from the tournament, like, just requesting a 0-point buy, since, I'm kind of mentally checked out, but I basically felt that, no, I paid good money to play in this tournament, and even if I play badly here, I don't actually care if I lose rating points. I care much more about experience. Like, rating is the sort of thing, like, I care much more about my play, like, improving my play. Like, rating will just catch up with me if I become stronger. Like, if I'm constantly playing like a 2200, then eventually my rating will be 2200. So, I wasn't too worried about what happens if I lose this game. So anyway, my opponent began with the move pawn to e4. I played knight to f6, Alekhine's defense. My opponent played e5. I played knight d5. My opponent played d4. And I decided, hey, why don't I try that funny little trick again. Try that weird line that very few people know about. My opponent played knight to f3. I played d5. As before, you probably remember the idea if you saw round 2. My opponent played bishop to d3, similar to my round 2 opponent. I played bishop to g4. My opponent now played knight bd2, deviating from that game. I still played pawn to e6, like you pretty much always play it, unless your opponent plays h3, in which case you take the knight. Anyway, my opponent now played knight b3. Oh, and one thing I can mention, like one thing I should probably mention, is if back in, let's see, this position here, if my opponent plays h3 and I go bishop to f5 and my opponent plays g4, really insisting on harassing this bishop, then in this situation, best thing to do is just bishop d7 and play e6, and then at the very least you have something to play against over here. Like, that's one very minor detail that I thought I should mention. Like, normally your opponents will not do that, but if they do, it's good to know what to do in that situation. Anyway, we have knight bd2, e6, knight to b3, trying to stop me from playing pawn to c5. And I decide to play knight 8b d7. Yeah, knight 8 d7, I should say. Really insisting on playing pawn to c5. I really want to get this break in. My opponent's very, very insistent on not allowing it, and I'm like, okay, fine, I'll do something else. I'll play knight to c4. And, this is kind of a funny move of basically attacking the bishop and attacking this pawn. My opponent more or less has to trade because if they move their bishop, they allow pawn to c5, and also it means that the move bishop e3 would have been like a complete waste of time. Like bishop to g5 is absolutely no good because I can just take like this, and then after takes, I will be up a minor piece. Like take, I'm just up a knight. That's an important little pattern to remember when you've got these kind of pins, this kind of stuff. Anyway, knight c4, my opponent took, which I was expecting. I took back with my pawn. My opponent now moves their knight, attacking my pawn, and I play pawn to b5. Part of the idea is that since my opponent no longer has a light square bishop, I'm not as concerned about opening this diagonal. I'm not that worried about it. It's not that big of a weakness. Opponent plays a4. I decide to respond with pawn to a6. Basically, if my opponent's going to take, I'll take, and then the rooks will see each other. These rooks will contest the a file, whereas if I played pawn to c6, that might fix my pawn structure, but that might also give my opponent the open file. I might not like that. Although, I think c6 was okay. Let's see. What does the engine think? Yeah, c6 is playable. c6 is fine. Although the engine actually does like a6 more. Anyway, a6, we have b3, and you might remember that I like to compare this line to the French, and I've also been studying the French a bit, so I thought, hey, why don't I get some experience doing some French defense stuff? I play pawn to c3, knight to e4, pawn to b4. We have knight to g3. The idea is behind knight to g3 is just to try to trap this bishop, try to force me to give it up. But I'm usually okay with giving up this bishop since normally in the French defense, this bishop is garbage. Normally this bishop is stuck behind the pawn structure and is very sad. So being able to trade it for a piece is fine. Like that's something that I'm very happy to do. h3. I trade, opponent takes back with the queen, very intuitive move. Damaging the pawn structure makes very little sense. I play queen d5, contesting this diagonal, fighting for it. Alright, so I'm okay with a queen trade here, since for one thing, it would improve my knight. It would put it on a very nice outpost where my opponent can't easily get at it. Like, the only thing that could get at the knight would be my opponent's knight. And even then, it's kind of tricky how that would happen, like maybe something like this. But anyway, that's not what happened in the game. We have knight to e4. I play pawn to h6, covering this square as something might want to go there. My opponent plays queen to g4, and here is where I make a little inaccuracy. Here, I probably should have actually played queen to c6, and we're going to see why. Like, I think if I had played queen to c6, I would have been totally fine in this game. And I probably would have played, held on for a bit longer, but I was exhausted. I played queen d7, queen b7, which isn't a bad move, it's just not the best move. We have rook d1, knight to d5, putting my knight on a nice outpost where it controls some squares, hits this bishop, all that good stuff. We have queen to f3 because I was threatening to maybe mess up the pawn structure a bit. Bishop to e7, pawn to h4. My opponent is going for a typical plan in the a3 c4 middle game in the advanced variation of the French defense. And I'm again going a bit wrong. Here, what's interesting is I actually could have just castled, which looks crazy, but can be justified. If I castle here, I was worried about losing this pawn, for example, but apparently this is actually winning. This is just super sharp. I was worried about things like queen takes here, check, for example, king here, and then, I don't know, maybe take this knight, for example, since the rook's under attack. But then we have this, and I did not calculate all this, but this is kind of interesting. And it's interesting that I could have actually just castled in that position. but that's not what I did. Like, I wanted to castle, but I played rook to f8 first, which was a bit wrong. My opponent, to their credit, did not castle kingside, which is a common mistake in the a3c4 middle game. It's often better to actually keep the rook on the h file so that it can come in from h3, for example. I now castled. Opponent played queen to g4. The engine doesn't like this move. I played rook to g8. Apparently, I can actually just play queen to c6 now and not even worry about this pawn, since the pawns aren't as important as piece activity or king safety in this position. But I play rook to g8. Opponent plays rook to f3. And I now play rook df8. And if you want, you can pause the video and try to find my opponent's next move. Rook df8 was a blunder. It's where I start to collapse. Like, I only noticed my opponent's next move like a few minutes after playing this move. That's how tired I was. It wasn't even a case of, making a move and then, oh snap, I blundered. It was more of a case of realizing 5 minutes later, oh snap, that wasn't good. Uh-oh. Oh, like, that's how checked out I was. That's how tired I was. So I will now reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. So my opponent now played rook takes f7. And I decided to just, play a crazy sharp position and just play into it. Like, I could have just, let my opponent take the pawn and then, do something else, like play queen c6. Like, the crazy thing is that if I had played queen c6 instead of queen to b7, this doesn't work. This tactic doesn't work because the queen defends this pawn. So I play here, takes, king d8, queen takes f7, rook f8. I'm trying to fight back. Queen g6. My opponent has to be mindful of knight takes, bishop followed by queen takes knight. Nice. I still go for knight takes bishop. We have pawn takes, bishop takes with check, king to e2. I'm only down one pawn, but my king is not safe. My king is unsafe. Queen to d5, queen to g4. Things are not looking so good. Like, at all. Like, you can see the engine evaluation. This is not a good position. And, like, I was considering going bishop to e7, but then my opponent can take this pawn and then probably win this pawn as well. Actually, no, wait. Can't do that just yet. The knight is hanging and stuff. Let's look at that line. Like, let's look at bishop to e7. Like, yeah, knight c5 is possible because if I take, then rook pins the queen to the king. Nasty stuff like that. King safety, very, very important. And there's also this threat of this, forking the king and rook, and, this. And, yeah. So I decided to instead go for pawn to g5. Opponent plays knight to f6, shutting down my rook. I decided to go pawn to h5. I'm counterattacking my opponent's queen over here, since my opponent's attacking my queen. I actually missed my opponent's next move. That's how tired I was. Normally, I would see this move like that. Normally I would have no issue seeing, this desperado tactic. Queen takes h4. I decide to sacrifice the bishop. Queen takes g2 check. Queen to f2. Queen to h3. Queen to f3. Queen to h2 check. Just trying to keep the queens on the board. Or just trying to do something. Maybe use these pawns to do something. But, this position is very much lost. I play pawn to g4. And after my opponent's, engine evaluation spoils it. If you want, you can now pause the video and it's white to move, mate in 2. Like, my opponent has checkmate in 2. So I will reveal the sequence in 3, 2, 1. So my opponent played the move queen to d5 check. Like, I didn't even notice that this was made into until it was too late. And it was in this position that I resigned. Like, maybe I should have played out the checkmate. I think that is more fun. I think under normal circumstances I would have done that, but I was just like, no, I get to go home now. Yeah, let's go home. But basically, there are two possible moves I could play. They both lead to mate. Like king here. Let's see. This is checkmate. And king to here. This is checkmate. So yeah, my opponent played pretty well this game. Myself, not so much, although the data that I got this game was still very valuable. Like the position that I got in the middle game, like that sort of a3, c4 French middle game was still, very valuable data to know about. Like that whole knight d4 idea, and then bishop takes d4, like trading the knight like that. Like I actually really liked the position that I got there, and my opponent, himself, after the game, they were like, yeah, you got a really cool position out of the opening. Like, I think it's actually quite good for you. Like, I was confused. I didn't know what was happening. And this was cool since, this is a line that I haven't really played much in Classical, that I haven't ever really played, like, either at my local club or at tournaments before. So it was good to get this data. And overall, in this tournament, I finished with a score of 2.5 out of 5, which is probably my expected score. Like, I'm probably not really gaining or losing much in the way of rating points, but I am pretty happy with what it is that I learned about what it is that I need to improve. Like, from what I see from these games, my openings, I'm kind of playing kind of at the 2200 level already. Like, my openings are excellent. Even if they might be weird, even if they might be openings that people might consider to be garbage, the way that I'm playing them, like, I'm playing them at the experience level of a 2200 rated player, in my opinion. But my endgames, I think, are at the 1800 level, and I need to work on them. Like, my endgames are okay, but they need work. My endgames seriously need work. I need to spend more time prioritizing them. As for tactics, like, you should always work on your tactics. You should always improve your tactics. Like, I think my tactical vision is okay. I think my main issue is just fatigue, is just, keeping my stamina up. Since when I'm tired, I miss things. Like, in this last game, I just missed so much stuff. Oh, man, I was exhausted. So, I am seeing good tactics. Like, in round 1, the tactical sequence involving g5 was excellent, in my opinion. Like, that attack, from a practical standpoint, was a winning attack. And, in terms of positional play, I think I'm doing fine over there as well. Like, I think in pretty much every game, in every middle game, I kind of understood how I should play the position. I understood what my plan should be. I was able to find moves, find ways to continue. Like, even in the final game, the way that I played it, like, I kind of recognized that it has a lot of similarities to the a3, c4 middle game in the advanced variation of the French defense. And so even there, I think my positional play was good. I just, put my queen on the wrong square. It belonged on c6. And so overall, I'm pretty happy with this tournament. I'm pretty happy with the data that I got, and I'm going to try to keep improving and hopefully at some point in the future reach 2200 and become a national master. So I hope that you enjoyed this recap. Let me know in the comments if you would like to see more tournament recaps, more of my games like this. And bye for now.